CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 3, Part 13, Audio by Renee Matthew. The ruling of Charles I in England was totally different from the rule which was prevalent in France, and that is why there were a lot of differences between the ruling party, the parliament, the formation of the parliament, and how it was proceeding. The procedures were totally different. Now, the parliament forced King Charles' lineage, that is the next king. King Charles was executed, but after that the next monarch was forced to call the parliament regularly and consult with them if any decision is going to be taken. Now, France had a republican form of government and England had monarchy system. That was the difference. That is even now it is continued that way. It is because of the different directions that the histories of the two countries took after 17th century. So if you ask why it is like that right now, why France is following a republican form of government and England the monarchy, it is because of the turn of history which took place after the 17th century. And most of the changes took place between 9th and 17th century. And it took a great turn, especially after the 17th century. Directions were different, and that is why histories also just turned. Now I'm putting the pictures of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. There's a lot of difference in the way they sat. This is the modern picture. It was not like this earlier, but it got modified into this particular style. Of course, the place where they gathered is of ancient origin. It was built long time back. Maybe it just got renovated after that. But this is how they met together. The arrangement, the seating arrangement. Here it is more of people and here it is less of people. And here you have all the commons who come together and discuss affairs, and here it is the other way around. Changing cultural traditions. This is something which is a part of our chapter. The heading itself is that, changing traditions. So now, because of all these things, how did the culture change? How did tradition change? That is what we have to look into. From the 14th to the end of the 17th century, everything was changing, especially there was an expansion in the number of towns which sprung up. So, there was a distinct urban culture which came into being, which was very characteristic of a particular place. The urban culture which came into being in France is different from the one that sprung up in England. So distinctive urban culture was there in either of the places. Townspeople started calling them more civilized than the rural people. Even now we find these differences. Townspeople have more exposure and they call them very civilized. Towns means Florence, Venice, Rome. They became the centers of arts and learning, and many people started coming together. They started meeting, and that is why they were more exposed. Artists and writers were patronized by the rich and the aristocratic people. So patronage was a very important system which was followed in those days, and people gave much importance to artistry, writing, and all these kind of things, and it was patronized by the rich and the aristocratic people. They started using them. Of course, the invention of printing led to a new phase when books and prints were available to more number of people. People started reading more, including those living in distant towns or countries. They started getting the copies, they started reading, and reading, of course, enlightened people. A sense of history. People wanted to keep a record of their history, and that sense was developed in Europe. And they started contrasting the modern or the contemporary world with the time of the Greeks and Romans. Everything they learned from the Greeks and Romans, and they started contrasting it with the ancient world. So by this time, Greeks and Romans were called the ancient world, and that is why we call it the old age or the ancient world. So they started looking at the contrast, and the comparison was always made. Religion was becoming very independent, and people could choose the religion that they wanted to be in. Faith was very, very personal, and they could just choose it for himself. It was no more imposed on anybody. Now, there was a belief that especially the church believed that the earth is the center of the solar system. That was overturned by reasoning and logical skills, especially by the scientist, because we saw the era of reasoning by this time, and scientists started questioning it. And then they began to understand that we have a solar system and Earth is just one of the planets in the solar system. So new geographical discoveries were made, and that overturned the Europe-centric view. Okay, the complete view was changed, that the Mediterranean Sea was the center of the world. People believed in all these kind of things, that it was the center of the world and such things. Everything got overturned with inventions and discoveries. Lot of material was gathered, especially on European history. From the 14th century, they started becoming very conscious. People started getting very conscious. They started collecting documents, printed books, paintings, sculptures, buildings, textiles. These are the things which has come down to us, and that is why we are able to also go into the detail of history. So they started becoming conscious of the distinctive culture and history. Much of these were preserved carefully in archives, art galleries and museums in Europe and America. So all this preservation took place many centuries back ago, okay? And that is why we have to be thankful to those people. It is not that suddenly things were done. They started preserving everything in their own way, but of course they took care so that it comes down to us over the years. And that is how things took place. There was a lot of care which was actually done to preserve everything, and that is why it has come down to the ages to us. Now, from the 19th century, there were a lot of changes, and that is how the historians used this particular period as the Renaissance. Renaissance was a period where people saw a lot of changes, the style of thinking, the style of living, everything changed. It was a kind of thing which the ancient people could not even dream of. All the changes which happened during the Renaissance period could not be even dreamt of. If anybody opened their mouth about the changes that took place during the Renaissance period, suppose somebody from the ancient period even thought of it, they would lose their life. That was the kind of condition. So much of change, especially literally and rebirth. It was a rebirth of so many things, and it led to the change of culture all over the world. First, it started with Europe, okay? The historian who emphasized these kind of changes was a Swiss scholar. His name is Jacob Burckhardt. He was a Swiss scholar who emphasized on all these cultural changes, especially of the University of Basel in Switzerland, and he was a student of the German historian Leopold von Ranke. And this information about this particular scholar is very important, where he did his studies and where he worked. All those things are very important. Now, Ranke had taught this particular person that the primary concern of any historian was to write about states and politics. We have to write about the states and politics so that we get an insight into the changing culture, tradition which took place economically, politically, and all ways. And that was done using papers and files of government departments. They will gather all these resources from different places, government departments. They will gather papers and files. They studied about it. And that is how they had a clear-cut view into what happened in different states and politics. Burckhardt is a person about whom we are talking now, the Swiss scholar. He was very dissatisfied with these very limited goals. He said that if you just collect papers and files of government departments, it becomes limited. These are limited resources. So, his master had set out for him because he was very dissatisfied. According to Burckhardt, he felt that politics was not the be-all and end-all in history writing. There was something more. You should not rely completely on politics. It was just a part of history. History was as much concerned with culture as with politics. It was a kind of combination of everything, not only politics. And in 1860, all these kind of questions made him coin a book called The Civilization. And it was particularly about the Renaissance in Italy. In which he drew the attention of his readers to literature, architecture, and painting. He called the attention saying that there are a lot of changes which took place in Italy, especially in the facets of literature, architecture, and painting. And that really gives an elaboration of how the new humanist culture had flowered. Humanist culture flowered from literature, architecture, and painting. By learning all these professional things, it is not important that human beings will have an insight into humanistic culture. Okay, all these things will make people think, and that is how things were changed in Italy, especially in Italian towns from the 14th to the 17th century. So every flowering, everything took place at this time, especially from literature, architecture, and painting. This particular culture about which he wrote in Renaissance in Italy was totally different. It was totally different from what others wrote. It was characterized or featured by a new belief. What was the new belief? That man was an individual and he was capable of making his own decisions. He was independent and he was able to develop his own skills. He was an individual. That itself is a very great term. Man should be seen as an individual who has to operate on his own decisions and develop his own skills. So he was actually modern. Okay, he was supposed to be modern in contrast to medieval man. So modern and medieval man, that is when people started thinking about the contrast between modern and medieval man. And this kind of thinking was always controlled by the church. The difference between these two, the thinking was always controlled by the church. The kind of differentiation was controlled. The revival of Italian cities. How the Italian cities revived. What was the great change? You should always remember that the changes which took place in Italy also had a great impact in England. Okay? Again, we have to go back to history where the fall of the Western Roman Empire takes place. After that, political and cultural ruins were there in Italy. Nothing was actually happening in Italy. It was a big happening place. And after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we can see that politics, everything actually fell down. Everything went into ruins. There was no unified government. Okay. The Pope in Rome was a sovereign in his own state. He was a strong political figure. He started ruling. Without a particular body of government, the Pope was all in all. In Western Europe, what happened was that it was reshaped by feudal bonds. Everything was reshaped by feudal bonds in Western Europe, and everything was unified under the Latin Church and Eastern Europe, especially under the Byzantine Empire. So all the shaping was actually done by feudal bonds, and everything got unified under Latin Church, Eastern Europe, especially under the Byzantine Empire. And of course, we saw that Islam was creating a common civilization further west. And it was very busy creating this civilization, and Italy became very weak and fragmented. So shaping was actually done slowly. Unification also took place under the church, Eastern Europe also under Byzantine Empire, and common civilization was created, and Italy was actually weak and fragmented when all these changes were taking place in Europe. And that is why this particular point is given here. When all these developments were taking place in Europe, what happened? Italy was getting weak and fragmented. However, with all these developments which helped in the revival of Italian culture, we can get to know about what happened in Italy. Revival means things which were drained, things which got drowned once upon a time was taken back. It was revived. So with the expansion of trade between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic countries, of course they continued the trade relationships between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic countries. The ports on the Italian coast revived. All these ports started coming back to life. Okay, till then it was weak and fragmented. Now it is like it was a wake-up call for Italian coast. And after that, from the 12th century, what happened? The Mongols started encouraging trade with China, that too via the Silk route. We came to know about the Silk route through the Mongols. And trade played a very important part in Western European countries that also increased, and towns played a very important role. There was trade which was operating between the Western European countries, and Italian towns played a very important role in having this trade. They acted as a mediator between these places, and that is how they flourished. They did not see themselves as a part of a powerful empire. Okay, they did not want to be a part of powerful empire. They know that they were devastated, but they saw themselves as independent city-states. Now they understood that they had fallen from great culture. You know how the western part of Italy fell, and then the eastern part also fell gradually. So now they wanted to revive, but they saw themselves as independent city-states. Two of these were Florence and Venice, and they transformed themselves into republics, and many others were court cities ruled by princes. Only Florence and Venice were transformed into the style of governing, it became republic, but all the others were under the influence of princes, and it was totally different. So we can imagine the amount of progress which took place. And Florence and Venice was very famous for trading also. So trade actually expanded whatever they had. Whatever resources they had actually started expanding under trade and commerce. And that led gradually to the revival of this particular place.